All right, welcome to today's Explainer, everyone. I'm absolutely thrilled to have you here in our virtual lecture hall. Today, we're going to be exploring a really fascinating intersection of cultural history, political philosophy, and literature. We're going to look at how the 19th century historical defense of Southern slavery maps directly onto the moral fable of John Ruskin's famous 1851 fairy tale, The King of the Golden River. Now, as an ethics professor, I absolutely love using these kinds of comparative lenses because they really help us uncover the true cost of wealth and that deep underlying relationship between ideology and human character. Let's get right into it. Here is our quick syllabus for today. First, we'll look at the ethics of economics. Then we'll examine the greed of the planter mentality. After that, we'll debate whether paternalism was a genuine ethic or just profound moral blindness. We'll define Ruskin's concept of unholy water, run through a quick tutorial on reading historical texts, and finally we'll look at the ultimate fate of the valley. Section 1. The Ethics of Economics, Setting the Theoretical Stage. Okay, so before we get to the fairy tale, we really need to set the theoretical stage. We have to understand the prevailing economic and political orthodoxies of the 19th century United States, and how they sometimes masked some pretty profound moral character flaws. Now, what's wild here is how directly the antebellum Southern thinkers oppose the founding principles of the United States. On one side, we have Lockean liberalism, the absolute bedrock of the Declaration of Independence, the idea that all men are created equal, governed by consent and a social contract. But then, as we see from the research in Grayson Meyer's thesis, thinkers like George Fitzhugh completely rejected Locke. Fitzhugh actually called the Southern movement a solemn protest against the doctrines of natural liberty. They were defending the semi-feudal, deeply illiberal order based on natural hierarchy. They argued that humans are born into circumstances of dependence, not some abstract equality. They vehemently, and I mean vehemently, rejected the Northern Free Society and its laissez-faire capitalism. Moving on to Section 2, Greed and the Planter Mentality, Ideology in Action. Let's transition to our first case study here. We're putting the economic engines of the Deep South side by side with the fictional antagonists of our fairy tale. So, looking at the fairy tale, we have the Black brothers, Hans and Schwartz, from Ruskin's The King of the Golden River. These guys are cruel, they are exploiters, and they treat literally everything transactionally. I mean, they care so much about wealth that they cruelly melt down their younger brother Gluck's prized family heirloom, a golden mug, just to get the raw currency out of it. Now notice how the transactional tobacco mentality of the Tidewater planters perfectly mirrors that selfish greed. The planter aristocracy was entirely dependent on a brutal system of slavery, completely obsessed with status and driven by cash crops. These were the river kings of Alabama, men who controlled the waterfronts and steamboats, building empires while turning human beings into pure economic capital. It's like a perfect, if unsettling, mirror image. The really crucial point here is that Southern apologists were actually highly critical of others' greed, while simultaneously justifying their own. In this quote, William Harper is condemning Northern industrial capitalism for its cold greed, pointing out how the capitalist swells his fortune while the laborer's wages just get less and less. Men like Harper and George Fitzhugh argue that free markets led to a war of the wits, where the cunning just brutally exploited the vulnerable. But the irony here is massive. They use this precise critique of Northern wage labor to completely ignore their own systemic exploitation of enslaved people. Section 3. Paternalism or moral blindness. Justifying the unjustifiable. So, how on earth did these Southern thinkers attempt to reframe their greed as a moral virtue? And how does that contrast with true virtue as shown in Ruskin's tale? Well, this brings us to the concept of paternalism. George Fitzhugh and Louisa McCord argued that slavery wasn't about economic exploitation at all. No, they framed it as a form of domestic affection that supposedly protected laborers from the cruelties of the free market. Fitzhugh claims here that Providence extends this domestic affection over wives, children, and slaves. He argued the master loves the slave not like a miser loves gold, but like a father loves his children. But as students of history and ethics, we really have to ask ourselves, was this genuine affection, or was it merely a convenient rhetorical shield used to protect their immense wealth and status? And this brilliantly illustrates the difference between a carefully constructed ideological mask and actual genuine morality. Take Gluck, for example, the young, kind-hearted brother in Ruskin's tale. When Gluck climbs the mountain to find the Golden River, he encounters a dying old man, a fair child, and a prostrate puppy. Even though he is literally dying of thirst himself, Gluck gives up his last precious drops of water to save them. That is because true virtue requires personal sacrifice. On the flip side, our sources suggest Southern paternalism required absolutely zero personal sacrifice from the masters.
Instead, it relied entirely upon the sacrifice of others just to maintain the master's luxury.
I want to pause for a second and pose this question directly to you. Is Southern paternalism a genuine ethic, or is it just a mask for the exact same transactional greed we see in the Black brothers? I really challenge you to critically assess this. Think about it. The Black brothers pretended to be legitimate goldsmiths, right? But they were really just hoarding wealth. Weren't the River Kings doing the exact same thing, just hiding behind the shiny mask of chivalry? Section 4. Defining unholy water, the metaphor of exploitation. Let's take the core metaphor of Ruskin's text and apply it directly to the political realities of the antebellum South. It's a real game changer when you view it this way. In the fairy tale, the king of the Golden River tells Gluck that the water his brothers threw into the river was unholy. Why? Because they denied it to those dying of thirst along the way. Because of that, the brothers were turned into black stones. Politically speaking, the wealth of the South was exactly that, unholy water. It was accumulated through systemic human exploitation and the absolute denial of basic human dignity. Both of our source texts today ruthlessly critique the human cost of a purely materialist worldview. Whether it's the Black brothers melting down a beautiful, irreplaceable heritage piece just for raw currency, or the planter aristocracy viewing human beings strictly as economic capital to be traded down the river, the end result is exactly the same. You end up with a society where the cunning simply exploit the vulnerable in a war of the wits, and that inevitably leads to massive societal decay, which is only temporarily masked by immense, highly concentrated wealth at the very top. Section 5. Tutorial. Ideology and Character. Okay, let's step out of the narrative just briefly. I want to give you a quick methodological tutorial on how to analyze historical primary sources for these exact themes. You can use a rubric just like this one to map fictional elements directly onto historical ones. Notice how both authors challenge the economic orthodoxy of their eras. For masking greed, Ruskin has the brothers pretend to be legitimate craftsmen. Historically, planters framed slavery as paternalism. For human cost, Hans denies water to a child. Historically, the system reduced humans to property. And for failed stewardship, agricultural neglect serves as this incredibly powerful metaphor in both accounts. The fictional Treasure Valley turns to red sand, while historically, tobacco and cotton literally exhausted the southern soil. So, next time you are reading historical texts for your own research, try following these 3 distinct steps to strip away the author's ideological mask. Step 1. Identify the real economic driver. Look for the cotton or the gold. Step 2. Locate the moral justification they are using to defend it, like chivalry or paternalism. And step 3, the most important one, look right past that justification to analyze the hidden human cost. Doing this reveals the true character lurking underneath the ideology. Section 6. Fates of the Valley. The consequences of illiberalism. To wrap up our explainer today, we absolutely must examine the physical and societal ruin that inevitably follows failed stewardship and unchecked greed. Check out the chronological parallel here. In the real world, the 17th century Virginia tobacco boom began exhausting the land, demonstrating an economic dependency incredibly similar to the brothers' greed. By the 1830s, the cotton gin pushed this extraction to the Deep South, driving a massive domestic slave trade. By the 1850s, the Steamboat River Kings ruled the Alabama waterfronts, building staggering wealth at an incredible human cost. But just as the Black brothers' cruelty caused the personified southwest wind to flood their valley and turn it to barren red sand, the South's reliance on cash crops and slavery physically exhausted the soil and led directly to societal ruin. The editor of Ruskin's work, Oliver Lodge, noted this absolutely powerful takeaway. Ruskin warns us that true wealth comes from careful, sustainable stewardship of the land, from the soil, not from violently extracting resources or hoarding gold through metalliferous undertakings. This was a harsh lesson that the soil-depleted, war-torn South learned far, far too late. They mistook extractive currency for true, sustainable wealth. I want to leave you with this final, provocative thought. If the Black brothers were turned into black stones in the river, and the River Kings of Alabama eventually lost their empires to the railroads and the ravages of war, we really have to look in the mirror today. Where in our modern economic orthodoxies are we still creating unholy water? Where are we masking extraction and exploitation behind polite moral justifications? Think about it. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking the hard questions, and I'll see you next time.